Fairhaven was the kind of town you could miss if you blinked. Tucked into the shadow of the White Mountains, it was a place of cracked sidewalks, weathered barns, and a town square that hadn't seen a new coat of paint in decades. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Genevieve, Evie. Martell woke to the faint hum of her alarm clock and the sound of birds scratching at the feeder outside her bedroom window. For a moment, everything was as it should be, the weak November sunlight filtering through thin curtains, the distant rumble of a delivery truck rolling past. But when she sat up, the weight on her wrist made her freeze. A thin, blood-red thread was tied tightly around her left wrist, the knot impossibly small and precise. It wasn't there when she went to bed. She was sure of it. The thread stretched taut, vanishing through the crack beneath her bedroom door. She blinked at it, her heart stumbling over itself as her pulse quickened. What the hell? Did I fall asleep with yarn or something? She muttered, but her voice wavered. She didn't own red thread, or yarn for that matter. Evie climbed out of bed, wincing as the cold hardwood floor bit at her bare feet. The thread followed her movements, as though tethered to something far away. A distant hum accompanied it, so faint she could barely hear it, but persistent, vibrating through her bones. It made her teeth ache. She tugged at the thread gently and it resisted, pulling back as though it were anchored to the earth itself. A sharper pull made her wince. A sharp, almost electric sting burned through her wrist. She let go immediately. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she opened her bedroom door. The thread extended down the hallway, cutting through the air like a knife. She followed it cautiously, past family photos hung crookedly on the wall, past the flickering overhead light her landlord had promised to fix 2 weeks ago. Her thread stretched out of the apartment entirely, disappearing under the front door. Evie opened the door and stepped outside. The town square was quieter than usual. A thin fog rolled across the uneven cobblestones, curling around the legs of the old memorial statue. Evie wasn't the only one staring at the threads. They were everywhere. Everywhere she looked, she saw people standing in confused knots, staring at the thin strings tied to their wrists. The colors varied: red, white, black, even pale green. But every string led somewhere. A man's string stretched across the square into the post office. A child's yellow thread disappeared into the fog. An elderly woman sat on a bench, her string tangled in a knot so dense it was impossible to see where it ended. The fog thickened as the day progressed, curling between the cobblestones like pale fingers. By noon, the town square looked like a surreal spider's web, with people standing in uneasy silence as they tried to understand what was happening. Evie wandered the streets, her mind reeling. Every time she pulled at her thread, the electric pain shot through her wrist, leaving her skin raw. The tugging sensation wasn't random. It felt deliberate, insistent, as though the thread were alive and guiding her somewhere. Her unease deepened when she saw a toddler sitting in her mother's lap, her string coiling upward toward the clouds like smoke. She caught snippets of conversation as she walked. "I woke up with it this morning," a woman whispered to her friend. "What does it mean? Is it some kind of punishment?" A shopkeeper muttered, "My string leads to an empty field. Nothing there. What's it trying to tell me?" The postmaster stood in the doorway of the post office, his thread stretching toward the sky. He stared at it with hollow eyes and whispered, "They're marking us. We're being sorted." Evie's stomach churned. She grabbed the arm of a passing mailman, a grizzled man with a string that stretched up toward the clouds. "Hey, what's going on?" she asked. The man shrugged, his face pale. "Dunno. Woke up like this. Everyone's got one." His voice cracked slightly, and he rubbed at his wrist, where the string left an angry red impression. Evie looked around, her pulse quickening. The sight of the strings unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Some people were already experimenting with theirs, tugging on them gently or following them to their destinations. A man across the square held scissors in his hand, his mouth a tight line of determination. "Don't cut it," the mailman said suddenly, his voice sharp. "A guy tried earlier. He didn't make it." Evie's eyes snapped back to the man with the scissors. She watched as he opened them, hesitated, then snapped the blade shut on the thread. The scream that followed wasn't human. The man dropped the scissors immediately, clutching his head as blood poured from his nose. His body twisted violently, folding in on itself like a crumpled sheet of paper. In an instant, he was gone, his thread fluttering uselessly to the ground. The remaining threads above the square seemed to ripple in response, humming faintly, as if warning the town not to interfere. Evie took a step back, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The mailman crossed himself, muttering under his breath, "We shouldn't be messing with these. They're not ours." She turned and walked away. The image of the man's crumpled body burned into her mind. By mid-afternoon, the threads had become the only topic of conversation. Evie wandered aimlessly, following her string to the edge of town, where it led into the woods behind the old Black Hollow church. The place had burned down decades ago, but no one ever bothered rebuilding. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches creaking in the wind. Evie hesitated at the tree line, her fingers twitching nervously. The thread vibrated faintly, as if urging her forward. She swallowed hard and stepped into the woods. The air grew colder as she followed the string deeper into the forest. Dead leaves crunched underfoot, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. After what felt like hours, she reached the charred remains of the church. The string stretched straight through the ruined doorway. Inside, the air was stifling. The thread led her to the pulpit, and as she reached it, her eyes were drawn to an inscription carved into the wood. "Tangle, sever, and the world unravels." Her breath caught. The words felt ancient, older than the church itself. She touched the thread cautiously, and for a moment her vision blurred. A flicker of something appeared, a memory not her own. She saw faces twisted in agony, heard voices crying out in languages she didn't understand, and felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The sensation vanished as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping. She stumbled back, only to freeze when she saw the figure in the doorway. The figure stood tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too thin to be human. Long, delicate fingers hung at its sides, and from each fingertip dangled dozens of strings that glowed faintly in the dim light. Its head tilted slightly, as if observing her, though it had no face, only a void filled with shifting threads. The weaver. The figure didn't move, but the strings did. Evie froze, her breath hitching in her chest. The figure in the doorway seemed to fill the space without moving, its presence oppressive and vast despite its slender, skeletal frame. The strings dangling from its fingers swayed in an invisible breeze, their faint luminescence casting eerie patterns on the charred walls of the church. Her own string pulled violently against her wrist, yanking her toward the doorway where the figure waited. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. "Run! Get out of here! Don't let it touch you!" but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The figure tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, and began to move. It glided forward soundlessly, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if the act of walking was merely a suggestion. As it drew closer, Evie saw that its face, or what should have been its face, was an empty void. Strings writhed across the darkness, weaving and unweaving patterns that made her stomach churn. Her body finally obeyed her. She turned and ran. The forest was darker now, the fading afternoon light barely piercing the thick canopy above. The skeletal branches seemed to stretch toward her, clawing at the sky. Her string snapped taut behind her, burning against her wrist as it pulled her forward. Evie sprinted blindly, her breath tearing through her chest. The sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs filled the air. Whether they were her own or something else's, she couldn't tell. When she broke through the tree line, she nearly collapsed in relief. The town was in chaos. People were shouting and pointing at the sky, where hundreds of threads, thousands maybe, converged into a dense web above the town square. The glowing strings crisscrossed like veins, pulsating faintly as if alive. Evie stumbled into the square, clutching her wrist where the string had rubbed her skin raw. It's real, she gasped to no one in particular. Something's out there. No one seemed to hear her. A group of teenagers stood near the diner, staring at a man who was frantically yanking at his thread. "Stop it!" one of them shouted. "You saw what happened to the other guy." "I can't live like this," the man screamed, his voice breaking. "I can't." He pulled harder, and the string snapped. The air around him seemed to ripple. He let out a strangled cry as his body began to contort, his limbs bending at impossible angles. Threads erupted from his skin, stretching outward into the glowing web above. Within seconds, he was gone, replaced by a new strand woven into the tapestry. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by horrified silence. Evie backed away, her legs trembling. She turned to leave, but froze when she saw a familiar face. The old man from earlier, the one without a thread, stood on the corner, watching her. His expression was grim, his eyes flicking nervously toward the web above. He beckoned to her sharply, then disappeared down an alley. The alley smelled like mildew and damp asphalt. The old man stood near a stack of broken crates, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tattered coat. Up close, he looked worse than before. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes ringed with shadows. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The thing in the woods?" Evie stammered. "What is it? What's happening to us?" "They're called weavers," the man said, his gaze darting nervously toward the alley's entrance. "They keep the threads, control them. They've always been here, watching. But something's changed. They're not just watching anymore." Evie swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "Why don't you have a thread? How do I get rid of mine?" The man shook his head violently. "You don't want to get rid of it. Cutting it?" He trailed off, his face tightening. "Let's just say you'll wish you hadn't." "Why not?" she pressed. "What happens?" "They unmake you," he said flatly. "Every thread is tied to something, someone, your choices, your life, your death. Cutting it is like cutting out a piece of the world itself. The weavers don't like that." Evie's heart pounded. But why me? Why now? The man's gaze shifted to her wrist, where the red thread glowed faintly in the dim light. "The threads don't just tie us to places or people. They tie us to our fates, to everything we are, and everything we could be. Severing it doesn't just take your life, it erases you. Every choice you've ever made, every connection you've ever had. He leaned closer, his breath sour. They're not gods, they're predators. A faint rustling sound echoed down the alley. The man stiffened, his eyes widening in terror. They're here. Evie turned, her stomach dropping. A shadow stretched across the mouth of the alley, impossibly tall and thin. The weavers had found her. "Run!" the man hissed, shoving her toward the other end of the alley. "Follow your string. It's the only way." Evie ran, her lungs burning as she followed the pull of her string. The streets of Fairhaven were nearly empty now, most people having retreated into their homes or been taken by the threads. The glowing web above the town seemed to pulse faster, the threads vibrating with an ominous hum. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her. The thread pulled her toward the window, where it stretched into the distance, glowing faintly in the dark. She collapsed onto the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The old man's words echoed in her mind. Follow your string. It's the only way. But where would it lead her? And would she survive long enough to find out? Evie startled when she saw movement outside her window. A figure stepped into the moonlight, its clothes torn, its face pale and drawn. The string tied around its wrist was thicker and darker than hers, coiling tightly. He looked up at her window, his expression grim, and gestured for her to come outside. She hesitated but felt her thread pulling toward him almost insistently. When she stepped into the street, the man, Elias, spoke first. "You're following it too." His voice was hollow. "I've been following mine for weeks. It's led me through places I can't even explain. Every time I think I understand, it changes." Evie shivered. "Why are our strings connected?" Elias's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know, but it scares me. It's like whatever's waiting for us isn't just fate. It's a choice we haven't made yet." The shadow rippled across the wall, undulating like oil spilled on water. Evie scrambled backward, her palms skidding across the floor as her heart slammed against her ribs. The weaver emerged slowly, impossibly tall and skeletal, its form almost translucent in the faint glow of the strings outside. The strands hanging from its fingers twitched, moving as if they had a will of their own. "Evie, move." Elias's voice cut through her panic, snapping her back to reality. Her string tugged at her wrist, harder than ever before. It wasn't just pulling, it was demanding. It vibrated with urgency, as though warning her of something she couldn't yet see. The weaver tilted its faceless head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity, and reached toward her. Long needle-like fingers extended, the strings attached to them swaying hypnotically. Evie bolted, Elias close behind. They barely registered the cold as they sprinted through the streets of Fairhaven. Their strings were their only guides, glowing faintly in the dark like beacons. The threads twisted and turned through the labyrinth of streets, leading them down alleys and past houses where curtains fluttered as unseen eyes peered out. Behind them, the faint hum of the weaver's presence never wavered. Their movements were soundless, yet both Evie and Elias could feel them, like cold hands brushing against their skin. The strings above the town vibrated in unison, creating a low, haunting hum that seemed to seep into their bones. Evie stumbled as they reached the outskirts of town. Elias caught her arm, steadying her. "Keep going," he urged, his voice tight with fear. It's leading us somewhere. Where? She gasped, her chest heaving. How do we know it's not leading us straight to them? Elias shook his head. We don't, but stopping isn't an option. Their strings led them down a dirt path she barely remembered. It wasn't until the charred remains of the Black Hollow Church loomed ahead that Evie realized where they were going. The ruins stood like the ribs of a long-dead beast, skeletal and foreboding in the moonlight. Evie hesitated at the threshold, her breath fogging in the chill night air. The burned-out walls seemed to hum faintly, resonating with the vibrations of the threads above. Elias pushed ahead, his string pulling him forward with an urgency that made him stumble. It's not just the church, he muttered. There's something beneath it. Beneath? Evie's voice wavered. The idea of going deeper into the unknown sent a shiver down her spine, but her string tugged insistently, pulling her forward. Inside the church, the air was stifling. The threads hummed louder, their vibrations reverberating through her skull. The pulpit sat in the center, just as it had before, but this time she noticed something else, a faint shimmer of thread surrounding it, forming a delicate web. Elias knelt by the pulpit, his hands hovering just above the shimmering strands. This is it, he murmured, the entrance. What do you mean, entrance? Evie asked, her voice sharp. But before Elias could respond, her thread pulled violently. The moment her wrist brushed the web, her vision blurred. When Evie's sight cleared, she wasn't in the church anymore. She stood in a cavernous space, impossibly vast and filled with the glow of countless threads. They stretched in every direction, converging and diverging like the veins of some great living organism. The air felt heavy, charged with a hum that seemed to resonate with her heartbeat. The loom, Elias said softly, his voice tinged with awe and dread. The loom dominated the space, an ancient creaking structure made of blackened wood and twisted metal. It pulsed faintly, as though alive, the dark wood shimmering with a texture that resembled flesh. The threads it wove were endless, their glow almost blinding as they disappeared into the void above. Dozens of weavers moved around the loom, their spindly fingers deftly manipulating the threads. Each movement sent ripples through the web, creating patterns that shimmered like starlight. The air around them vibrated with a soundless hum, a frequency that made Evie's teeth ache. Elias stepped cautiously toward the loom, his string vibrating violently. This is it, he murmured. This is where everything comes together. Evie's thread stretched toward the loom, its crimson hue stark against the pale glow of the others. Her heart pounded as she followed it, stepping carefully between the strands. She saw now that their threads were intertwined, pulsing faintly as though communicating. What is this place? She asked, her voice trembling. What does it mean? Elias's gaze stayed fixed on the loom. The threads are our lives, our choices, our fates. The weavers don't just maintain the web. They control it. Who lives, who dies, everything. His voice dropped to a whisper. But there's something wrong. I think they've lost control. Evie stared at him, her stomach twisting. What do you mean? Before Elias could answer, the cavern trembled. The weavers stopped their work, their faceless heads snapping toward her and Elias in unison. Their fingers twitched, the strings around them vibrating violently. They know we're here, Elias said, his voice tight. We need to leave, now. The weavers descended like shadows cast by a flickering flame. Evie and Elias ran, their strings pulling them toward a new path that opened in the web. The threads seemed to guide them, shifting and parting to create a narrow corridor. The weavers followed, their movements eerily silent. The cavern reacted to their presence. Threads around them vibrated violently, some snapping with deafening cracks that echoed through the void. Each snap sent a ripple through the loom, distorting the glowing web above. Evie caught glimpses of shapes forming in the web, faces, cities, entire worlds unraveling and reassembling. Elias grabbed her arm, his voice sharp. "Don't stop. If we disrupt the threads..." A deafening hum cut him off. Evie turned and saw a weaver grasping a broken thread. Its faceless head turned toward them, and the soundless hum became a roar in her mind, filling her with a primal, overwhelming terror. They sprinted faster. Finally, they burst through a shimmering wall of threads and stumbled back into the burned-out church. The night air hit Evie like a slap, cold and sharp. She turned to Elias, her chest heaving. "What now?" she gasped. Elias didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on something behind her. She turned slowly. A weaver stood in the doorway, its strings writhing like living things. Elias grabbed her arm. "Run!" They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town. The strings above Fairhaven were brighter now, pulsating in a rhythm that felt almost alive. Evie's string tugged at her wrist, leading her toward the horizon. "What happens if we keep following them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We find out where they end. And if we don't?" He glanced back toward the town, where the glowing web seemed to throb like a heartbeat. "Then they find us." The two of them stood in silence, their strings pulling them forward. Behind them, Fairhaven glowed faintly in the dark, a town caught in the grip of the weaver's web. Evie took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown.